Good day, this is Robin's Arts and Crafts. This next project is a paper mache unicorn that I found and covered it in gesso. That gives us so much opportunity for covering a three-dimensional object with all kinds of sprays and inks and watercolor and acrylic paint. You can even go for a little gold spray paint. It was really a lot of fun and I think it came out really cool, and I hope you make one too. So this is the paper mache unicorn that I found, and it occurred to me that you could also paper mache over a plastic horse, like the Brer horses I think they're called, that you probably had as a kid, or My Little Pony even. I really loved My Little Pony as a kid, and this is sort of inspired by that. You'll notice where I put the placement of the flowers. You're gonna see what I'm doing. So you're gonna wanna cover it in gesso, and I actually covered the whole thing in a nice coat of gesso and then let it dry, and I think covered it 2 more times just to get a real solid white opaque layer on there. Technically you could use if you were doing acrylic paint, just 1 layer of gesso would be fine, or even no gesso. Since I'm going to be using Inktense inks, you could be using watercolors with this method. I want to have the sort of toothy layer of the gesso rather than a smooth acrylic to work on, so that it'll have something to grab onto. So when the gesso's completely dry, you can move on to the next step. You'll need some water and an assortment of paintbrushes in different sizes. I like to have some good pointy ones and some round ones and some flat ones. Paper towels, watercolor pencils are a nice start, just so that you can map out what you're doing. It doesn't look as awkward as graphite. Some kind of a palette. So here I'm just mapping out the basic design that I want. I didn't really think about it too much. I kind of wanted some circle-shaped flowers and the stem to go down the back leg. You're going to want to go really lightly so that you don't really see like really strong pencil lines. Even if they're water soluble, they still kind of leave a little bit of a mark, especially these cheap ones. So I'm going to be using Janedavenport's Inktense inks, and when they dry, they're not really very water reactive again. They dry almost permanent. And I love all the colors. You want to kind of swatch them out and look at which ones look best together. And I'm going to tell you the truth about the first side of this project. I felt like the colors got really out of control and way too rainbow, and it kind of didn't really work together, but I'm gonna leave it because there's still some good techniques. Even though I wasn't really happy with how it came out, I should have swatched them out like I'm telling you together to see what looks good with what. I just kind of went in. So here I'm doing wet on dry. So that's gonna have a very different effect than if you were to wet the whole area with water first. That was one of the purple colors. I forget the names, but you're gonna want them all, I guarantee you. And then I'm going in with some yellow, and I dropped it into the center so that it would kind of make some kind of blooms, thinking that the yellow would push the purple out a little bit. And they're opposite on the color wheel, so you're sort of risking it looking a little bit muddy. The yellow didn't really push the purple away as much as I expected it to because it's not watercolor paper. So here I'm going in with one of the blue colors. And dropping that into it also in little dots to see what that's going to do. If you let the purple dry completely first, it's going to react differently than if you do wet paint into wet paint. The colors will mix together and bloom and push each other around and bleed, and that's really kind of what I'm going for here. So dropping some more yellow into the center to really push that purple out, and you can see it's kind of starting to make a ring where the yellow and the purple are overlapping. Kind of a little bit of a brown kind of ring, but I'm okay with that. So here I went in with some clean water first to do a little bit more of a wet on wet technique. These are watercolor terms, and the paint is going to react differently on a wet surface than it did on a dry surface, and I was hoping that I could get them to bloom and bleed together a little more easily that way. I love this green color with the mermaid tail on it. I think I'm dotting some more water onto the blue just to kind of get the pigments to move and push around a little bit more. And now I'm going in with the green on the wet paint. And that one kind of bled in a way that I wasn't really expecting because I tipped it up. But I'm okay with it just kind of being a little bit messy because I'm experimenting. So again, wet on wet, so I'm wetting the circle with water first before I go in with the yellow so that the colors will move around more easily. It's a really tricky surface to work on because it's not flat, so you're not going to get the same effects that you would if you were working on flat watercolor paper. It's almost like if you were trying to work on a page that was tipped up. So it's a little bit challenging, but you know, a little challenge is good for you. So here I'm just making stems. And you have to be careful if you let the paint touch from, for example, like the yellow-orange flower to the green. If they touch together while they're still wet, they'll bleed together. I started adding some blue in the space where the eye was and didn't really end up finishing it. I had a different plan, and I kind of just ended up not really liking where it was going because I felt like there are too many colors in the color wheel all over it, and they kind of just didn't really work well together in the end. But it's okay because I kind of like had a little time to figure out how the mediums work on this really different surface that I'm not used to working with, so I just left it so that you could learn from my mistakes as well. That's okay. So I was working yellow into the pink, hoping that they would kind of blend together to create an orange here, trying to do kind of a rainbow mane. And the colors don't bleed together on this surface and this gesso as easily as I was expecting them to, so I had to go in and add a little bit, like mix some orange, and here I'm adding green, hoping that it'll blend nicely into the yellow. And again, it's not blending as easily as it would on paper. So it kind of ended up looking more like rainbow stripes. And I didn't really love that. I could have just skipped that part, but I figure if you can see what about it didn't work and what did work, that it will be helpful to you. So it's okay to leave it if it's not perfect. And there are parts about it that I like. It just, overall, I just didn't think really hit it off. A little purple on the ends. I really think also a lot of the time when you're doing the first layer of a painting, it goes through what they call the ugly stage, and there are that parts where you just don't like it and you think, what the heck did I just do? And this is probably where that's at. So if I were to keep working on it with other mediums, I think I probably could have brought it around, but I had a whole other side to work on, so I just ended up kind of taking what I learned from the first side and flipping it over and creating something that I ended up liking better. So that's the second part, and the colors that I'm thinking about playing with. So I decided to do a wet on wet stripe for the stem. However, this time I didn't use green for the stems. I kind of wanted it to look more like watercolor drips coming down and bleeding into each other and being a little bit more of like an abstract flower thing than a straightforward, this is the green stem. And dropped a little more ink and let it run into the wet part. Kind of going for a little more of an inky, bleedy mess, which is what's really beautiful about these particular pigments, so you might as well work with what works, right? So here's some flowers and leaf shapes. Letting them kind of bleed and drip. Now you can see how that drip went down the back. It wasn't what I intended, so you're going to have a little bit of trouble trying to control it if you're working on a three-dimensional surface and tipping it all over the place and it has curves, so you're going to need to just kind of expect that and not get frustrated. You can always paint back over it with gesso and acrylic to cover up the little accidents. It's not a big deal. But I'm purposely trying to let those colors kind of drip down. And here I'm getting the whole tail nice and wet so that I can do a more drippy, runny version of what I had done in the mane. And I was thinking maybe if I didn't use quite as many colors or do it in that stripy pattern that I did the first time, that it would work better. It's kind of hard to film this because I'm having to tip it up so the drips run in the correct direction but still have the camera pointed at it, so I'm sorry if you can't super easily see what I'm doing here, but you're just basically gonna have fun with some inky mess. I imagine these will really stain your clothes and furniture and stuff, so maybe put down something to protect your surface and be careful before you're having a big ink splash in your house if you care about that. So here I'm going with blue, knowing that when it mixes with the red, it's going to create some purples and letting that drip down. So now it feels like the colors are moving in the direction of the hair, so I didn't have the same problem that I ran into with the rainbow mane that just looked like weird stripes, because it's moving in the right direction. And because inky drips. Kind of going back and forth between adding water and ink to just let it bleed and see how much I like of this or that, and just reacting to it basically. Didn't really have a particular plan, but go in and create the same technique on this side of the mane in a way that I think will work better with the shape of the mane and the colors and the way they flow, the same as the tail, and let the ink run in the direction of the way the mane runs. I think it came out a lot better. You can definitely also do this with watercolor. You could just get it really wet and messy, or you could even use liquid watercolor. Just know that it's going to reactivate if it gets wet. So you might need to hit it with some kind of spray or something to keep it fixed in place. Just kind of building this up with layers because I didn't want it to be too strong in all of the areas. I wanted to have a little variation of value in the color, which means how light or dark the color is. And the thing that I think is working about this, the colors that I chose on this side as opposed to the others, is that it's mostly colors sort of on the same side of the color wheel. There's red, purple, and blue, which are next to each other instead of all opposites all over the place. Just it's a little more harmonizing. So I'm going in and adding the hooves. I painted them wet first, and I wanted them to kind of just be variety of all the colors that I used in the project, so that they'd kind of look like a little bit just like magical milky watercolor mess. So I'm going in with the colors that I've used, but I want to use a little bit of blue here and a little bit of pink there. I don't want it to just all be the same, so I'm kind of letting it be a little bit messy and uneven, just because I think it gives a little bit more of a kind of magical, whimsical effect that way. Kind of made me think like the horse was sort of jumping and dancing through the paint. So after the Inktense on the hooves dried, I went over it with some gold acrylic paint and left it kind of a see-through layer so you could see the colors through it, and did that on the horn as well, but it looks like I might not have recorded that part. I'm sorry. It's pretty self-explanatory. I painted the eye here with matte acrylic paint and let that dry first before I added kind of a shiny blue color for the iris. You can't really see it unless you tip it a little bit. I was kind of trying to decide if I wanted the eye to look more like an animal-shaped eye or have a little bit more of a human quality to it, so I started with giving it more of an all dark shape and decided it just kind of got lost. So now I'm going in with some white acrylic, and it's adding the whites in the sides, which kind of give it a little bit more of a human looking quality, and I ended up liking that more. I mean, it's a unicorn, you can do what you want, right? Here I'm going in with some white acrylic and kind of cleaning up some of the edges that got a little out of hand. And I decided I didn't really like the blue stem with the leaves on the right. So I tried to paint over it with gesso and acrylic, and I gotta be honest, the Inktense, for as much as I think it's supposed to dry pretty unmovable. It was really bleeding through those layers, and it took a few tries to kind of get it covered up. Every time it would dry, it would continue to bleed back through. But I ended up kind of liking it in the end because it kind of looked like, sometimes watercolor paintings will have sort of a lighter color of the same shape behind it, and it will give it a sense of depth, like it looks like it's off behind it and a little bit faded out because there's more atmosphere in front of it. You know, the way mountains get lighter as they go further away, so it kind of had that quality to it. I ended up cleaning it up a little bit around the edges more so that it didn't look quite as messy because it kind of bled the paint around, but I ended up kind of liking the way that that looked in the end, just accidentally. So sometimes when you make mistakes, they turn into happy accidents. I was just kind of cleaning up the eye a little bit with going back and forth to fix the messy points. I gave her a little nostril in there with the black. Going back over some of the accidental drips with white acrylic just to clean that up. And honestly, I didn't really think to do this, but probably the gesso is going to sort of hold on to a lot of dust and will get fingerprints and grime stuck to it pretty carefully. So if you're going to leave it white, I would suggest going over it with some kind of a clear coat or just adding some white acrylic to those parts so that it doesn't end up just looking really dirty, because gesso has that grit to it. So it's definitely going to, it's a porous surface, so you need to put a sealer on it if you're going to keep it sitting on a shelf. And I don't know what else you would do with it, so yeah, put something on top of it. I think this would make a really fun birthday gift for a kid. I'm a big kid, so I would just put this on my shelf and call it good. I'm adding a little bit more white acrylic on top of this part to try to cover it up a little better. I felt like I was kind of fighting with it at this point, but in the end I ended up liking it. It's all good. So really, any medium that you could paint onto paper, you could add onto this. You could add pastels, you could do colored pencils. I really love Janedavenport's paint over pens, and the colors that they come with go really nicely with her paints because she planned that. So I'm gonna go in and add some little doodles and designs just to give it a little bit more interest. Not really thinking about it too much. I do want to sort of try to keep the colors a little bit consistent, not add too many crazy new things though, because keeping away from that whole rainbow thing that happened on the other side, I decided was probably a good plan. some little hearts around the flower, little dots here and there, just to give it a little bit more design again. And I ended up going over that sort of ghost leaf shape that wouldn't go away, deciding to roll with it. But don't paint pens just kind of take it to a new level of fun? That really gave it a little something. So now I'm trying to decide what it still needs, because I think I need to take it a little further. So I decided to add some patterning and details up near the mane. Its hair, just to give it some lines and flowing. And I ended up adding some leaf shapes in it because it kind of looked a little bit like watery seaweed to me, actually. So that's kind of what I had in mind when I was making these shapes. So again, the same thing with the tail, just bringing in a little bit of green, a little bit of design, and a little bit of pop to make it a little more interesting, and a little bit more color with that green into the eye, because the kind of silvery color was just a little bit flat, needed a little more. And generally eyes, well, there's a lot of different colors in them, and they'll be reflecting what's going on around them too, so. It's all about the paint pens. So think about all the different three-dimensional things that you could repurpose even. I like to go to the thrift store and just find strange things to paint on. It's a really good way to make something old into something new and fun. I really like the way this one came out. She's pretty cute. Thank you, Jane. We love your paint.
Thank you for joining me today. If you enjoyed my video, please like and subscribe. You can also find me online at robinsnestartschool.com.